4 teenage girls from the Bronx generated millions with their voices, only to end up working as bank tellers to pay the rent. Their breakout hit sparked the most infamous copyright lawsuit of the 20th century. Yet, when the federal court handed out a massive $1.6 million settlement, the Chiffons received nothing. How did the American legal system function as a perfectly legal machine of exploitation, completely erasing the very architects of its wealth from their own legacy? In the 1960s, America was deeply segregated. On the streets, the civil rights movement was fighting systemic oppression with protests and violence. But inside the recording studios of New York and Detroit, the music industry was manufacturing a sanitized alternate reality. Black artists were dressed in flawless sequined gowns and tuxedos, required to sing cheerful, upbeat pop songs. The profound political and economic realities of their demographic were entirely erased. They were packaged to sell a flawless, non-threatening image to a mainstream middle-class audience. This was the golden age of the girl groups. However, many major hit factories of this era operated on a ruthlessly efficient economic model. They took the raw, authentic sound of black neighborhoods, polished it, and packaged it for a mainstream middle-class audience. The artists themselves were subjected to a process of relentless psychological and physical re-education. It was not enough to possess a spectacular voice. One had to possess the correct demeanor. Artists were sent to in-house finishing schools, famously referred to as charm schools, where they were taught how to walk with rigid posture, how to hold a teacup, how to articulate their words without a hint of regional dialect, and how to smile continuously, even when faced with deeply invasive or demeaning questions from the press. They were not treated as sovereign creators. They were engineered dolls, highly sophisticated machinery calibrated to fit a precise market segment. It is within this machinery that we find the fatal weakness, the tragic flaw that would seal the fate of almost every young artist of that generation. A profound desperation fueled by youth and socio-economic deprivation. In the early years of the 1960s, the Bronx, New York, was a landscape of limited horizons for a young black girl. The pathways to wealth or national prominence were virtually non-existent. It was in the hallways of James Monroe High School that 4 teenagers, Judy Craig, Patricia Bennett, Barbara Lee, and Sylvia Peterson, began singing together. They were just children, really, girls harmonizing in the stairwells, dreaming of a life beyond the concrete of their neighborhoods. They possessed a sound that was electric, a blend of youthful innocence and undeniable raw talent. When you are 14 or 15 years old, living in an environment where financial security is a daily struggle, the concept of the future rarely extends beyond the end of the week. So imagine the intoxicating, blinding flash of opportunity when older, wealthy men in suits arrive from Manhattan offering an escape. Imagine being told that your voices are special, that you will be taken to professional studios, that your names will be printed on vinyl records, that you will wear beautiful dresses and travel the country. In that overwhelming moment of validation and promise, questions about long-term intellectual property rights, royalty percentage points, and the legal definition of copyright ownership are never asked. The girls were not looking at the fine print. They were looking at the door being held open for them, terrified it might close if they hesitated. This desperation, This completely understandable human desire to escape poverty and achieve greatness was the exact vulnerability the music industry was designed to exploit. The contracts placed in front of these teenagers were not agreements between equal partners. They were masterpieces of psychological manipulation and legalized theft. The Chiffons, as they would soon be known, were brought into the fold of a production company called Bright Tunes. Bright Tunes was operated by members of the Tokens, a white doo-wop group who had found massive success with the song "The Lion Sleeps Tonight." The Tokens had transitioned into production, understanding that the real wealth in the music business did not come from standing in front of the microphone. It came from owning the paper that dictated what happened behind it. The paperwork the Chiffons signed, often requiring the co-signatures of their working-class parents who were equally unversed in the labyrinthine complexities of entertainment law, amounted to what can only be described as a contract of non-existence. The system operated on a standard template of exploitation. The artists would receive a microscopic royalty rate, perhaps 1 or 2 pennies per record sold, to be split equally among the 4 members. But even this meager sum was an illusion. The contracts were laden with recoupment clauses. Every expense the label incurred, the studio time, the session musicians, the manufacturing of the vinyl, the promotional photographs, the glittering dresses they wore on stage, was treated as a debt owed by the girls. Until that fabricated debt was paid off, the girls saw almost nothing. They were effectively placed on a small fixed weekly allowance, a starvation wage disguised as a salary, while the company absorbed the vast oceans of profit generated by their voices. But the financial theft was only the secondary crime. The primary tragedy, the true horror of these documents, lay in the absolute transfer of intellectual property. In 1962, a young songwriter named Ronnie Mack brought the Chiffons a simple, catchy tune called "He's So Fine." While Mack held the legal rights to the composition, it was the Chiffons who gave the track its distinct identity. In the studio, the girls added their own vocal arrangements, including the rhythmic background chant, "Doo-lang, doo-lang, doo-lang." This improvised harmony would eventually become the focal point of a multi-million-dollar legal war. That chant, those specific harmonies, that exact vocal attitude that was not written on Ronnie Mack's sheet music, that was the lived experience, the cultural heritage, and the spontaneous artistic genius of 4 teenage girls from the Bronx. They took a good melody and transformed it into a cultural earthquake. When "He's So Fine" was released in early 1963, it did not just chart, it exploded. It spent 4 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It sold over 1 million copies, almost instantly. It became the defining sound of the spring of 1963, a melody that would be permanently etched into the consciousness of the American public. Yet, when the ink dried on the legal filings, who owned this cultural phenomenon? Bright Tunes Productions held 100% of the copyright to the song. Furthermore, standard industry contracts of the era frequently dictated that the label owned the master recordings entirely. The girls did not own the song. They did not own the arrangement they had created. Shockingly, on a fundamental legal level, they did not even possess the rights to the recorded sound of their own vocal cords. This is the chilling reality of the capitalist framework operating within the music industry. The law did not recognize the sweat, the breath, or the soul poured into the microphone. The law only recognized the signatures on the corporate letterhead. The Chiffons were not legally viewed as the creators of a multi-million-dollar asset. They were viewed merely as the replaceable machinery used to manufacture it. They were the engine that drove the vehicle, but they possessed no title to the car. The tragedy was compounded by a cruel twist of fate. Ronnie Mack, the young songwriter who had discovered them, who had brought them the song, and who might have served as their advocate and protector in the ruthless halls of the industry, collapsed shortly after the song reached number 1. He was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma and died tragically at the age of 23, right as He's So Fine was dominating the globe. With Mac gone, the girls were left entirely defenseless, surrounded by corporate managers whose sole fiduciary duty was to maximize profit for themselves. The stage was now perfectly, mercilessly set. The Chiffons had breathed life into a melody that was destined to become one of the most recognizable pieces of intellectual property in the 20th century. They had generated immense, unimaginable wealth for a corporation that viewed them not as human beings, but as line items on a balance sheet. They were trapped in a legal vacuum, bound to a contract that demanded their constant labor while legally divorcing them from the fruits of that labor. They were about to learn that the glamour of the television screens was a carefully constructed facade, masking a system that was preparing to devour them. The trap of the white paper had snapped shut. They were now the legal pawns in a game they did not even know they were playing. And as Bright Tunes began to face its own financial mismanagement in the years to come, the true value of that copyright would be weaponized. The melody they had sung in the stairwells of the Bronx was about to become the center of a multi-million-dollar international war, a war in which the creators themselves would be rendered entirely invisible. The music industry in the mid-1960s was not a place of artistic nurturing. It was a highly efficient extraction operation, and the commodity being extracted was human energy. Once He's So Fine captured the apex of the Billboard charts, the 4 teenagers from the Bronx were immediately thrust into a grueling, almost inhuman schedule of physical and emotional labor. The public saw the final polished product: 4 joyful girls in matching pastel dresses, swaying in perfect unison on television screens, their smiles radiant and unwavering. They appeared to be living the ultimate American fantasy. But the physical manifestation of their psychological state told a remarkably different story, one written in the dark circles under their eyes and the bone-deep exhaustion they carried onto every cramped tour bus. They were immediately booked onto the relentless circuit of package tours, most notably the Dick Clark caravan of stars. This was not a glamorous life. It meant traveling thousands of miles across a deeply segregated and volatile America in un-air-conditioned buses, sleeping, sitting up, and eating whatever food could be hastily acquired from roadside diners that often refused to serve them because of the color of their skin. They were expected to perform multiple shows a day, stepping out onto stages in theaters across the country to deliver the exact same 3 minutes of infectious joy over and over again. They were singing He's So Fine, a song about teenage infatuation and innocent longing while navigating a deeply hostile adult world of racial prejudice and corporate exploitation. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. They would stand on a stage in front of thousands of screaming fans who knew every word to their song, experiencing a level of adulation reserved for royalty. Yet, when the curtain fell and the stage lights dimmed, they returned to a reality defined by profound financial insecurity. They were internationally recognized superstars who still had to worry about how they were going to afford basic necessities. They were holding plaques commemorating millions of records sold, yet they were riding the subway back to their working-class neighborhoods in the Bronx, indistinguishable from any other commuter, except for the heavy, invisible burden of their stolen legacy. The mechanics of this theft were hidden beneath the cold, mathematical architecture of their contracts. In the eyes of the law, a hit song is not a piece of art. It is a piece of real estate. And in this particular real estate transaction, the girls were merely the hired construction workers who built the house, while the production company, Bright Tunes, held the deed to the land. Every time He's So Fine was played on the radio, it generated a performance royalty. Every time a vinyl record was purchased at a local shop, it generated a mechanical royalty. These streams of revenue were immense, creating a river of capital that flowed continuously. But the river was carefully diverted away from the Bronx. The publishing rights, the legal ownership of the musical composition itself, belonged to Bright Tunes and the estate of the late Ronnie Mack. The girls were entitled only to a fractional artist royalty based on the physical sales of the record. However, even this microscopic percentage was largely an illusion, neutralized by a predatory accounting practice known as cross-collateralization. The label treated every single expense associated with the Chiffons, the studio rental, the session musicians, the manufacturing, the promotional materials, even the glittering dresses they were required to wear, as a debt. This debt was placed squarely on the shoulders of the 4 teenagers. Their tiny royalty pennies were seized by the company to pay back these inflated expenses. Furthermore, if their next single failed to sell as well as He's So Fine, the costs of that failure were added to their tab. They were trapped on a financial treadmill, running at full speed just to keep their balance at zero. The song was generating millions of dollars in pure profit for the men in the executive suites, while the girls who gave the song its voice were handed a modest weekly allowance, effectively keeping them in a state of perpetual financial adolescence and total dependency. This is the profound philosophical tragedy of recorded music. When a human voice is captured on magnetic tape and pressed into vinyl, it becomes immortal. The joyous, energetic dueling of the Chiffons was frozen in time, eternally youthful, eternally perfect. But the human beings who produced that sound were not immortal. Their throats grew tired. Their bodies ached from the endless travel. They aged. They had families to support. And they faced the relentless grinding pressure of adulthood in an unforgiving economic system. The corporation owned the immortal ghost of their youth, while the women themselves were left to deal with the harsh reality of their mortal deterioration. The voice on the radio was wealthy. The woman walking down the street was poor. As the 1960s progressed, the cultural landscape shifted violently. The British invasion, led by the Beatles, completely altered the dominant sound of pop music. The era of the girl groups began to wane. The Chiffons continued to record and tour, scoring a few more hits, but The explosive momentum of 1963 was gone. The music industry is a machine that requires constant accelerating growth. When a group can no longer provide that exponential growth, the machine simply stops looking at them. The executives at Bright Tunes began to lose interest in the Chiffons as active touring artists. They stopped investing in top-tier songwriters and expensive studio time for the group. But while they lost interest in the human beings, they guarded the intellectual property with the ferocity of a dragon hoarding gold. He's So Fine had transitioned from being a current pop hit to something far more valuable, a standard. It was a song that was constantly played on oldies radio stations, constantly licensed for compilations, and constantly generating a steady passive income stream. The girls had been squeezed dry, but the paper contract they had signed as teenagers remained as potent and profitable as ever. By 1968, the crushing weight of this reality became too much for Judy Craig, the lead singer whose powerful, distinctive voice had carried their greatest hits. She was no longer a starry-eyed teenager. She was a young mother trying to feed her family. The meager allowances from the label and the exhausting, low-paying gigs on the road were simply not enough to sustain a life. In a moment of quiet, devastating heartbreak, Judy Craig made the only rational choice available to her. She walked away from the microphone. She left the Chiffons. She took off the glamorous stage costumes, packed away the physical remnants of her international fame, and entered the civilian workforce. The woman whose voice was known by millions of people across the globe, the woman who had anchored a song that was generating vast fortunes for white executives in Manhattan, took a job as a bank teller in the Bronx. Later, she would find work as a secretary. Imagine the profound psychological humiliation of that transition. Picture Judy Craig standing behind the counter of a bank, counting other people's money, dealing with the daily indignities of a low-wage, working-class existence. And then imagine the radio playing softly from the manager's office in the background. Suddenly, the opening piano chords strike, and her own youthful voice comes pouring out of the speaker, singing, "He's So Fine." She has to listen to the ghosts of her past celebrating a triumph she is not allowed to share. She has to watch customers tap their feet to the rhythm of her stolen labor. Her art had been severed from her life. She was a living, breathing casualty of a corporate heist, forced to endure the daily torment of hearing the weapon used to rob her broadcast on the public airwaves. For the remaining three members, Patricia Bennett, Barbara Lee, and Sylvia Peterson, the situation was equally grim. Lacking the specific lead vocal power of Judy Craig and facing an industry that had moved on to harder rock and soul, they were relegated to the margins. They had no other marketable skills. Their entire youth had been consumed by the Motown-style machine. They were forced to continue performing under the name the Chiffons, playing in increasingly smaller venues, county fairs, and nostalgic oldies reviews. They were trapped in a perpetual reenactment of their teenage years, singing their golden hit for a fraction of what it was truly worth, merely to keep the lights on in their apartments. While the creators of the song were fading into working-class obscurity, the legal entity that owned them was also quietly bleeding to death. Bright Tunes, the company managed by the Tokens, had failed to adapt to the changing music business. Through a combination of poor investments, changing tastes, and general mismanagement, the company was heavily in debt and inching closer to the precipice of bankruptcy. The executives who had so masterfully exploited the teenage girls from the Bronx were now finding themselves outplayed by the larger, more ruthless forces of the corporate world. By the end of the 1960s, Bright Tunes was essentially a hollow shell. It had almost no active artists generating new revenue. Its offices were quiet, but hidden within the filing cabinets of that failing company was a vault containing pieces of paper that represented immense untapped wealth. The catalog of copyrights, specifically the 100% ownership of He's So Fine, was their only remaining life raft. The song was a dormant asset sitting quietly, waiting for an opportunity to be monetized once again. This is the ultimate tragedy of the commodification of art. The human beings who created the magic were discarded, deemed no longer useful, left to struggle in the shadows of their own monumental success. But the piece of paper, the contract signed by naive teenagers in 1963, retained all its power. The legal system did not care that Judy Craig was working as a secretary. The legal system did not care that Barbara Lee was singing at a small-town fair to pay her rent. The legal system only recognized that Bright Tunes, a failing corporation, possessed a legally binding monopoly on a sequence of musical notes. The stage was now perfectly set for a collision of epic proportions. On one side, you had a desperate, dying production company holding on to a highly recognizable musical property like a hostage. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the aftermath of the biggest cultural phenomenon of the 20th century, a deeply spiritual musician was searching for a sound to express his newfound devotion. As the calendar turned to 1970, the world was about to witness what happens when a stolen musical legacy intersects with the boundless wealth and immense power of rock and roll royalty. A new song was about to be broadcast across the globe. It would be hailed as a masterpiece of divine inspiration. It would bring comfort to millions. But for the women working in the Bronx and for the desperate executives clutching their contracts in Manhattan, those familiar opening chords would not sound like a prayer. They would sound like the beginning of the most brutal, cynical, and lucrative legal war the music industry had ever seen. The ghosts in the machine were about to be resurrected, not to be saved, but to be used as ammunition. The dawn of the 1970s brought the collapse of the greatest cultural monolith of the modern era. The Beatles had officially disintegrated, leaving a vacuum at the very center of the global musical universe. For George Harrison, the youngest and arguably the most spiritually restless member of the band, this dissolution was not a tragedy, but a liberation. Having spent years standing in the immense, suffocating shadows of John Lennon and Paul McCartney, Harrison was finally free to release the backlog of music he had been quietly crafting. He was deeply immersed in Eastern philosophy and the Hare Krishna movement, seeking a universal divine connection that transcended the trappings of pop superstardom. In late 1970, Harrison unveiled his magnum opus, the triple album All Things Must Pass. It was a towering artistic achievement, a sprawling landscape of slide guitars, heavy orchestration, and profound spiritual yearning. And the crown jewel of this collection, the lead single that would carry Harrison to the absolute pinnacle of global success as a solo artist, was a track called My Sweet Lord. The intention behind My Sweet Lord was undeniably pure. Harrison wanted to construct a mantra, a piece of music that seamlessly blended the Western Christian Hallelujah with the Eastern Hare Krishna, demonstrating that the search for the divine was a universal human experience. When the song hit the airwaves in November of 1970, it was a revelation. It soared to #1 in the United States, the United Kingdom, and across the globe. It became the highest-selling single of 1971. It elevated George Harrison from the quiet Beatle to a spiritual icon, bringing comfort and religious ecstasy to millions of listeners worldwide. But as the song saturated the public consciousness, a jarring, inescapable realization began to ripple through the music industry. As the acoustic guitars strummed and Harrison's voice glided over the slide guitar intro, listeners felt an immediate, haunting sense of déjà vu. The primary musical motif, a simple 3-note ascending phrase followed by a descending 4-note phrase, was not just familiar, it was identical to another song. When Harrison sang the syllables, "My sweet Lord," the notes landed exactly on the precise melodic footprints of the words, "He's so fine." And when the background singers shifted into the chorus, the progression mirrored the exact cadence of "Dulang, Dulang, Dulang." This was not a vague similarity in genre or tempo. This was a structural mirror image. Musicologists would later testify that the two songs shared the same underlying musical architecture, differing only slightly in the grace notes and the lyrical content. Imagine the scene in the dim, desperately quiet offices of Bright Tunes Music in New York. This was a company teetering on the edge of the financial abyss, drowning in debt, its roster of artists largely inactive. The executives who had once engineered the exploitation of 4 teenage girls from the Bronx were now staring at their own corporate mortality. And then, from the radio sitting on a cluttered desk, pours the voice of a billionaire ex-Beatle, singing their melody. They did not hear a spiritual awakening. They did not hear a prayer to the divine. They heard a winning lottery ticket. They heard salvation. In February of 1971, the corporate machinery, fueled by the scent of fresh blood, activated. Bright Tunes Music Corporation officially filed a massive copyright infringement lawsuit against Harrison's Music Limited, George Harrison, Apple Records, and everyone involved in the distribution of My Sweet Lord. The resulting lawsuit demanded millions of dollars in damages for copyright infringement. Yet the women whose voices made the melody famous were entirely absent from the plaintiff's table. Because Ronnie Mack wrote the song and Bright Tunes owned the publishing rights, the law did not recognize the singer's artistic contribution as property. The justice system framed the situation strictly as a property dispute between corporate entities, completely erasing the human beings whose stolen labor was the very subject of the conflict. The Chiffons were the undisputed architects of the sound, but in the eyes of the federal judiciary, they lacked the legal standing even to be robbed. As the lawsuit ground into motion, George Harrison found himself in a state of deep distress. He vehemently denied intentionally stealing the song. He maintained that the melody had come to him organically while he was strumming his guitar in Copenhagen, improvising vocal lines with Billy Preston. Many music historians, and even the judge who would eventually rule on the case, believed Harrison's testimony. They concluded it was a case of subconscious plagiarism, that Harrison had absorbed the ubiquitous melody of "He's So Fine" from the radio in 1963, and it had simply resurfaced in his mind years later, disguised as an original thought. But in the realm of copyright law, intent is largely irrelevant. If you own a piece of land and someone accidentally builds a house on it, it is still your land. Bright Tunes pressed their advantage aggressively, knowing they held the ultimate trump card, a melody that was generating unprecedented global wealth. However, the litigation dragged on for years, stalled by endless legal maneuvering, depositions, and the agonizingly slow pace of the federal courts. By 1975, Bright Tunes was effectively dead, having entered into receivership. They had the lawsuit of the century on their hands, but they lacked the capital to sustain the fight to the finish line. And this is where the plot twists violently, descending into the darkest, most cynical depths of corporate predation. This is where the story shifts from a standard copyright dispute into a masterful, cold-blooded corporate heist. To understand this heist, we must introduce the architect of the betrayal, Alan Klein. Alan Klein was a man who possessed a reputation that terrified even the most hardened executives in the music business. He was a brilliant, pugnacious accountant and manager who had built his empire by aggressively auditing record labels and recovering hidden royalties for his artists. He was known as a ruthless bulldog, a man who wore unbuttoned shirts and swore loudly in boardrooms populated by polished executives. He had managed the Rolling Stones, famously securing them a massive contract while simultaneously maneuvering to secure the copyrights to all of their 1960s master recordings for himself, a move that alienated the band but made Klein unimaginably wealthy. In 1969, as the Beatles were collapsing under the weight of their own business mismanagement, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr had hired Alan Klein to save their company, Apple Corps. Klein had stepped in, slashed budgets, fired staff, and aggressively renegotiated their royalty rates. For a time, George Harrison viewed Klein as a savior, an aggressive street fighter who could protect the artists from the parasitic labels. During his tenure as Harrison's manager, Klein was intimately involved in the defense against the Bright Tunes lawsuit. He knew every detail of the case. He knew exactly how much money My Sweet Lord was generating. He knew the internal legal strategies of Harrison's defense team. Most importantly, he knew that Harrison was highly vulnerable. But the alliance between the spiritual Beatle and the ruthless manager was doomed by its very nature. By 1973, the relationship had violently deteriorated. Harrison, Lennon, and Starr grew deeply suspicious of Klein's accounting practices and his thirst for absolute control. They abruptly fired him, triggering a massive, bitter, and highly publicized flurry of lawsuits between the former Beatles and their former manager. Alan Klein was not a man who forgave, and he was certainly not a man who walked away from money. He possessed a fatal weakness of his own, an insatiable need to dominate, to win at any cost, and to financially humiliate those who crossed him. Cast out of the Beatles' inner circle, Klein surveyed the battlefield and noticed a glaring vulnerability. He saw the Bright Tunes lawsuit still lingering in the courts, still unresolved. Klein knew two critical pieces of information that no one else had synthesized. First, he knew from his time managing Harrison that My Sweet Lord had generated an astronomical amount of money, meaning the potential damages in the lawsuit were in the millions. Second, he knew that Bright Tunes was bankrupt and desperate for a quick injection of cash. Operating in the shadows, utilizing a web of proxy companies, Alan Klein initiated one of the most audacious and venomous maneuvers in the history of entertainment law. While George Harrison was preparing to defend himself in federal court, believing his former manager was merely a bitter adversary in a separate dispute, Klein approached the receivers handling the Bright Tunes bankruptcy. He made them an offer. He offered to buy Bright Tunes Music Corporation entirely. He wasn't interested in their dusty office furniture or their forgotten roster of artists. He was buying their assets, and their only asset of value was the copyright to He's So Fine, which carried with it the ownership of the lawsuit against George Harrison. The executives at Bright Tunes, desperate to salvage anything from their ruined company, agreed. For a sum of $587,000, Alan Klein purchased the catalog. Pause for a moment and absorb the sheer terrifying brilliance and profound moral bankruptcy of this action. Alan Klein, the man who had sat in strategy meetings defending George Harrison against the plagiarism claim, was now the plaintiff suing George Harrison for that exact same claim. He had weaponized his insider knowledge. He had bought the gun that was pointed at his former client's head. But the tragedy cuts much deeper than a feud between two wealthy white men. Look at the collateral damage. Look at the invisible victims of this high-stakes game of corporate chess. When Alan Klein purchased Bright Tunes, he became the legal owner of He's So Fine. This meant he inherited the contracts of the Chiffons. The women whose voices had built the foundation of this entire multi-million-dollar dispute were now legally bound to the man who was using their legacy to execute a personal vendetta. Furthermore, as the lawsuit escalated, any remaining trickle of royalties that the Chiffons might have received from the continued play of their original 1963 recording was frozen. The corporate entity that was supposed to pay them was tied up in receivership and then bought by a man whose sole interest was extracting a massive settlement from George Harrison. We see here the ultimate manifestation of the drama-filled contradiction. In the court of public opinion, the story was framed as a battle of titans, the ex-Beatle versus the ruthless manager. The newspapers covered every day of the trial, analyzing chord progressions and dissecting Harrison's spiritual intent. The public debated whether a melody could truly be owned, or if there were only so many notes in the musical scale. Yet, beneath this grand spectacle, the true horror remained entirely unexamined by the press or the judiciary. The physical manifestation of this legal war was not taking place in the mahogany-paneled courtrooms of Manhattan. It was taking place in the Bronx, while Alan Klein and George Harrison deployed armies of lawyers costing thousands of dollars a day to argue over the ownership of the Dulang harmony. The women who actually sang it were struggling to survive. Judy Craig was still clocking in at her clerical job, taking orders from middle management. Her past life as a global superstar feeling like a fever dream. The other members were still grinding out performances on the grueling oldies circuit, their voices aging, their financial security non-existent. They were trapped in a horrifying paradox. The song they made famous was currently the most valuable, most heavily debated, most lucrative piece of intellectual property in the music industry. It was generating headlines across the world, but because of the contracts they had signed as naive teenagers, because of a legal system that prioritized corporate ownership over human creation, they were entirely locked out of the vault. They were forced to watch a man they had never met use their youthful art to extract millions of dollars from another man they had never met, while they themselves were left to sweep the floor of the arena. The trial of Bright Tunes Music Corp. v. Harrison's Music Limited finally went before Judge Richard Owen in February of 1976. Judge Owen was a unique figure for this case. He was a classical composer himself, a man who deeply understood the mechanics of music. He listened to the testimonies. He analyzed the sheet music. He listened to the experts dissect the sol mi re motif. In the courtroom, George Harrison sat with his guitar, attempting to demonstrate how the melody of My Sweet Lord had evolved organically from different chord shapes, completely independent of the Chiffons hit. He tried to explain the improvisational nature of songwriting, how a musician can stumble upon a sequence of notes that simply feels right, without realizing that it feels right because it has already been programmed into their subconscious by years of radio play. On the other side of the aisle sat the lawyers representing the corporate entity, now controlled by Alan Klein. They didn't need to argue about spirituality or artistic inspiration. They only needed to point to the cold, hard mathematics of the musical scale. The notes were the same, the rhythm was the same, the structure was the same, and they held the piece of paper that said they owned those notes. The trial was a masterclass in the clinical dissection of art, a song that had been born from the joyful, spontaneous harmonizing of 4 teenage girls in a high school stairwell, a song that had later been adapted as a sincere, desperate plea to the divine by a man searching for meaning, had been reduced to evidence in a corporate transaction. The soul had been entirely stripped away, leaving only the legal skeleton to be picked over by the vultures. As the judge retreated to his chambers to formulate his ruling, the industry held its breath. The verdict would not only determine the fate of millions of dollars, but it would set a legal precedent that would forever alter how music was written, recorded, and owned. But regardless of which millionaire won the lawsuit, the verdict for the girls from the Bronx had already been written in 1963. The system functioned exactly as it was designed to. The creators had been successfully erased. The only question left was how the spoils of their erasure would be divided. The gavel finally fell in the late summer of 1976. Judge Richard Owen, sitting in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, delivered a ruling that would permanently alter the landscape of international copyright law. He had spent months agonizing over the musical architecture of both compositions. He had listened to the experts, the musicologists, and the passionate defenses. His final written opinion was a masterpiece of legal and musical analysis. He concluded that George Harrison had not intentionally set out to steal the intellectual property of Bright Tunes music. He recognized Harrison's spiritual intent. However, the law of copyright does not require malicious intent. It only requires access and substantial similarity. Judge Owen introduced the world to the legal concept of subconscious plagiarism. He ruled that Harrison, having undoubtedly heard He's So Fine during its massive global dominance in 1963, had deeply internalized the melody. Years later, when seeking the perfect musical vehicle for his spiritual mantra, that identical sequence of notes had simply bubbled up from his subconscious. Harrison had believed it was divine inspiration, but the court ruled it was a suppressed memory. The penalty attached to this subconscious act was staggering. The court meticulously calculated the percentage of the All Things Must Pass album sales, the individual single sales, and the sheet music revenue that could be directly attributed to the melody of My Sweet Lord. The final number was mathematically precise and culturally shocking. George Harrison was ordered to pay damages amounting to $1,599,987. When the headlines hit the global press, the narrative was immediately oversimplified. The newspapers proclaimed that the Beatles guitarist had lost the biggest plagiarism suit in history. The public, reading the bold print over their morning coffee, naturally assumed that a great injustice had been righted. They believed that the four young women from the Bronx, the original voices behind the stolen melody, had finally been vindicated. They imagined a scenario where a massive financial windfall was about to descend upon Judy Craig, Patricia Bennett, Barbara Lee, and Sylvia Peterson. It looked from a distance like a triumphant underdog story. It looked like the American justice system had finally protected the vulnerable creators against the wealthy establishment. But the reality of the courtroom was a chilling, drama-filled contour. The truth was entirely divorced from public perception. The Chiffons were not the victors in this historic legal battle because they were not even participants. The check for nearly $1.6 million was not made out to them. It was made out to the plaintiff. And the plaintiff, as we know, was the corporate shell of Bright Tunes Music, completely owned and controlled by the ruthless former manager, Alan Klein. The massive settlement was destined to flow directly into the bank accounts of the very man who had engineered the corporate heist. The justice system had not vindicated the artists. It had simply validated a brutal corporate acquisition. The song was treated as a piece of stolen real estate, and the court was merely returning the rent money to the current landlord. The builders of the house were left out in the cold. However, the legal war was far from over. George Harrison and his legal team were devastated by the ruling, but they were deeply enraged by the identity of the victor. They knew that Alan Klein had used the intimate, confidential knowledge he had acquired while serving as Harrison's fiduciary manager to evaluate the profitability of the lawsuit and subsequently purchase the plaintiff company. This was not just aggressive business. It was a profound betrayal of trust. Harrison refused to write a check to the man who had stabbed him in the back. Instead of paying the damages, Harrison's lawyers launched a furious counteroffensive. They filed an appeal, arguing that Alan Klein's purchase of Bright Tunes was a blatant breach of his fiduciary duty. This countersuit plunged the case into another agonizing decade of depositions, hearings, and legal maneuvering. The original melody of He's So Fine was no longer just a pop song or even a stolen asset. It had become a weapon of mutual destruction between two extremely wealthy men. Try to visualize the profound absurdity of this situation. Picture the mahogany-paneled appellate courts of New York, teams of elite corporate lawyers charging hundreds of dollars an hour are debating the ethical obligations of music managers and the precise definition of fiduciary boundaries. They are producing thousands of pages of legal briefs. They are arguing over millions of dollars. And at the exact center of this swirling vortex of wealth and power sits the joyful, innocent 3-minute vocal harmony created by 4 black teenagers in a high school stairwell. While the lawyers argued over their legacy, the physical reality for the Chiffons remained bleak and humiliating. The legal freeze on the Bright Tunes assets meant that even the microscopic standard royalties the group had been receiving for the continued radio play of their original recording were completely suspended. The litigation had essentially put a padlock on their past. Judy Craig was still navigating the daily grind of her administrative job. The others were still clinging to the margins of the entertainment industry, singing in small clubs and regional oldies shows. They were forced to watch the entire spectacle unfold on television, entirely powerless. They were ghosts haunting their own masterpiece. They had to listen to legal commentators discuss the astronomical value of their voices, knowing that they could barely afford the gas money to get to their next low-paying gig. Finally, in 1981, the courts delivered another landmark ruling, one that introduced the ultimate devastating twist to the story. The appellate judge looked at Alan Klein's actions and agreed entirely with George Harrison. The court ruled that Klein had indeed breached his fiduciary duty. As a former manager, he was legally prohibited from using insider information to secretly purchase an adversary company for his own personal gain. The court's punishment for Klein was severe, but the mechanism of that punishment resulted in an outcome so twisted, so perfectly emblematic of the era's corporate rot, that it defies belief. The judge ruled that Alan Klein was not allowed to profit from his treachery. He was not allowed to collect the $1.6 million in damages. Instead, the court ordered George Harrison to pay Alan Klein exactly $587,000. This was the precise amount of money Klein had originally spent to purchase the bankrupt Bright Tunes company. The court was essentially reimbursing Klein for his initial investment, ensuring he made a profit of exactly $0. But what happened to the intellectual property? What happened to the copyright of He's So Fine? In exchange for reimbursing Alan Klein, the court ordered that all the assets of Bright Tunes music be transferred to the defendant. The court placed the copyright into a constructive trust and handed it over. Take a moment to fully comprehend the magnitude of this legal conclusion. George Harrison, the man who had been officially found guilty by a federal judge of plagiarizing He's So Fine, was now declared the sole legal owner of He's So Fine. The plagiarist had absorbed the plaintiff. By paying the penalty for his subconscious theft, Harrison had essentially purchased the very item he had stolen. He now owned the copyright to the original composition. He owned the publishing rights. He owned the master recordings. George Harrison now owned the legal rights to the vocal performances of Judy Craig, Patricia Bennett, Barbara Lee, and Sylvia Peterson. Every time the Chiffons' original 1963 recording was played on the radio, a royalty check was generated and sent to George Harrison's estate. This is the absolute zenith of the corporate heist. The system had cannibalized itself. 2 white men had fought a grueling decade-long war over the rights to a black cultural artifact. And the resolution of that war simply transferred the ownership from one wealthy man to the other. The original creators, the four women whose youthful energy and brilliant vocal arrangements had birthed the entire phenomenon, were bypassed completely. The law did not see them. The judge did not consider them. They were merely the raw materials used to construct the property that was being traded. They were the pawns swept off the board so the kings could complete their game. This horrifying legal reality forces us to confront the true nature of the music industry in the 1960s. We have been sold a narrative of glamorous television stages, magical recording studios, and the triumph of the Motown sound. But the empirical evidence buried in the legal transcripts of the Bright Tunes lawsuit reveals a different truth. The industry was not a platform for artistic expression. It was a highly legalized mechanism for racial and economic exploitation. The contracts were designed to separate the creator from the creation. The charm schools and the relentless touring schedules were designed to break the spirit and enforce total compliance. The system was a machine built to turn black art into white wealth, using the impenetrable shield of corporate copyright law to ensure the process was entirely legal. While the Chiffons were trapped in a legal nightmare, the 1970s music industry underwent a massive shift. Artists like Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye observed the bankruptcies and shattered lives of the 1960s girl groups. They rebelled. They hired independent lawyers, demanded creative control, and successfully retained their publishing rights. This revolution in artists' rights was magnificent, but it came too late for the Chiffons. They belonged to the transitional generation, the sacrificial foundation that built the corporate empires, the exact same laws that allowed artists in the 70s to negotiate fair deals had legally bound Judy Craig and her bandmates a decade earlier. The Chiffons lacked the leverage. They remained trapped in amber. Their youthful voices continued to generate millions for a billionaire ex-Beatle and a ruthless executive, while the women themselves faded into working-class obscurity. The final silent verdict of this entire horrific saga was delivered not by a judge, but by the relentless passage of time. As the 1980s bled into the 1990s, the legal files concerning Bright Tunes and George Harrison were finally closing, the appeals exhausted, the money permanently settled into the accounts of the victors. The music industry moved on to the era of CDs, megatours, and digital contracts. He's So Fine and My Sweet Lord both settled into the comfortable, highly profitable realm of classic hits radio. But the human toll remained uncompensated. On May 15, 1992, Barbara Lee, one of the teenagers who had layered her voice into the immortal Dulang harmony, suffered a fatal heart attack at her home. She passed away at the age of 44, living a quiet life far removed from the glittering stages of her youth long before the legal battles concluded. The $1.6 million lawsuit between George Harrison and Alan Klein permanently altered international copyright law, yet it offered nothing to the women who actually sang the notes. The legacy of the Chiffons stands not just as a catalog of classic hits, but as a permanent, undeniable record of a ruthless era, a system where the artists provided the soul, but the executives held the paper.